To talk about organic agriculture certification, we have Mr. Rajasingham with us. Mr. Rajasingham, thank you very much for being with us today. Now, you have a wealth of experience in this organic agriculture certification sector. Can you briefly talk about your experience and the different organizations that you worked with?
I have been working as an organic inspector for about 18 years. And I'm working with the foreign certification company. My activities have been mainly in the Asian region, and I have also been inspecting many crops. And hopefully by the end of this webinar or end of this discussion, I'm sure our listeners would be enlightened or more informed on the topic of organic certification.
So what we basically mean by certification in the organic value chain?
Well, like you said, the organic certification is very important. But the importance comes when you want to label a product in your target market and sell it as organic. And remember that organic certification is not a product certification. It's the certification of, the system of production. And it involves there are many areas, and there are many standards you have to be aware of. Unlike product certification, where you guarantee the quality of a product, in organic it's the system of production, where we guarantee the certification body or the certification system guarantees that the required standard has been followed.
So, Mr. Rajasingham, we have a basic understanding of what is organic certification is, but why it is so important for these value chains?
It becomes, like I said earlier, it becomes important when you want to sell a product as labeled as organic in the international market or even in the local market. Now, if you were going to sell it in the polar, as we call it, there is no need for this organic certification as such. But if you want to sell it as an exported product, then organic certification matters. Because unlike most certifications, organic certification becomes mandatory in certain markets. Like, for example, if you take the European market, by law, if you want to label a product as organic, the legal requirement is that it has to go through a certification process. It's the same with other countries like USA or Japan, the most important markets at the moment. So that is why the certification becomes important if you want to label a product as organic. Now, if you do not want to label a product as organic, certification is not that important.
Now, we have a better understanding of why organic certification is important. Now, what are the different ways that this can be approached or this can be achieved?
Well, generally, in my opinion, I would sort of differentiate between three types of certification.
Okay.
You have the first party, where me as a grower, I guarantee that this is grown organically.
Yes.
But that's between me and you. You are the buyer and I am the seller, and you trust me and I trust. I sort of certify.
So it's pretty much a trust-based
guarantee that it's. That is good when the buyer and the seller are known.
Yes.
Right? And the buyer and the producer are known. But like, for example, if I want to sell it, and then of course we have the second party certification, where somebody independent of me certifies that I grow my products organically.
Right.
Like, it could be another consumer. Like, you could certify me as being an organizer. That again is a question of trust. But when it comes to export trade, now most of the trade itself is regulated, and there are legal requirements. And to fulfill those legal requirements, independent third party certification is required.
Right.
So first party, second party will not work there. So when you talk about organic certification, we have to emphasize the fact that it's only independent third party certification that will be acceptable in the market.
Right. So in another way, the first party certification or the second party certification compared to a third party certification would definitely pitch a price premium, right?
It should. See, coming back to the first party and second party certification. See, third party certification involves some investment in finances. It costs you money to hire a certification body and to get it certified. But look at it this way, like if you have, but I mean, you know that we go to the puller and, there are farmers who actually produce these products organically, but they don't have the money to go in for certification. Yeah. So then we can have we have an alternative system to certification, which more or less is, which we identify or call it as the participatory guarantee system. The consumers certify the product as organic. And the consumer and the farmer is open, willing, transparent, he wants you to visit and guarantee his production as organic. Now that will work in a local market when the supply chain is very short, in an extremely short supply chain, and in the local market context, it will work. Where you know the buyer, you know the seller, but when the supply chain gets longer and longer, an independent third-party certification would become a necessity. Now, the alternative would be a second-party certification, where maybe a supermarket guarantees, but it's not because of legal requirements. That is also not possible.
Okay.
So, I think if you are looking at selling locally without labeling it as organic, a participatory guarantee system will work when the supply chain is short, where the producer sells directly to the consumer. But if the producer has to go through various steps before it reaches the consumer, then an independent third-party certification will become a necessity.
Okay, right. Mr. Rajasingham, let's talk more about this third-party certification systems or programs. If I'm an exporter, or if I want to put into the local market covered with a legal perspective of my production, what are my options?
Well, first and foremost, you have to decide what your target market is. And based on that, you have to decide thereafter which type of certification you require. Okay. Now, if your target market is Europe, then of course you will have to follow the European standards or what we call the European regulations. If your target market is USA, then the NOP rules will have to be followed. And the other most popular or more frequently requested certification is for the Japanese market, where it's called the JAS standards. So apart from this, you also need to be guided by your buyer. I say this because sometimes the European buyers or the US buyers, they will want to re-export their product. Either to the European buyer may want to re-export the product to US, or the US buyer might want to re-export a product to Europe. Okay. So in such cases, the main thing you have to remember is that just because you are certified according to EU regulation does not mean you automatically can sell in the US market. Okay. So you have to have your separate certifications. So for Europe, it's the European EU regulations. For US, it is the NOP regulations. And for JAS, the JAS is for the Japanese regulations. Now, the only advantage in having the NOP is it's considered equivalent to the Canadian organic regime. Okay. So if you have USDA NOP your certification, then you can export to Canada, but there are a few conditions which have to be fulfilled, which the certification body will guide you on. The most important thing to remember is that you can start with the EU regulation, right? Because there is what we call a conversion period. Right. So the conversion period, depending on whether it is an annual crop or a perennial crop. Right. So generally for an annual crop, the conversion period is 2 years since the last use of a prohibited substance and the first organic sowing. Remember, first organic sowing, not first organic harvest. Right. For perennial crops, it is 3 years. Right. 3 years must lapse between the last use of a prohibited substance and the first organic harvest. Right. Now, for the NOP regulations, it is 3 years for both. Okay. Whether it is a perennial crop or annual crop, it is a 3-year transition period. Right. Now, So if you go through the step of EU, the EU certification or inspection process, right? By the time you complete 3 years, you automatically may qualify for NOP if you require it.
Right.
It's the same with the Japanese standards. Right. It's also 3 years. So you have to be careful or mindful of the fact that you don't have to get all 3 from the very beginning, because it's going to cost you money.
Yes.
Right? So if you only get the EU certification for the conversion process, you can come to a stage where it's not difficult to get the NOP or the JAS certification.
Right. And I have another interesting question. Now, Mr. Rajasingham, you talk about this conversion period. Now, conversion period you still produce, right? So how do you market that? During a conversion period, the product that you are getting.
Okay, what you have to remember, most important thing to remember is, during the conversion period, you have to fulfill all the requirements of the relevant standard. So whether it is EU or NOP. So it's not that you have to follow, not that you can avoid following the standards. So during the conversion period, you have to follow the standards. Right. Now, during the conversion period, you can market your products, except in the first year of conversion. Okay. So the first year of conversion, you cannot sell it you have to sell it as what we call conventional. Right. You cannot sell it as anything else. Okay. But the second year onwards, you can sell it as a product in conversion to organic agriculture. Though there is a limited market. I wouldn't say there's a big market, but there is a limited market, and you may not get a premium for in-conversion products. So that mainly will be only for the EU, NOP, EU, US and Japanese markets. So there is a market, especially with perennial products, perennial crops, but it has to be labeled as in-conversion, and there are certain labeling requirements for that.
There's another thing I want to talk about, Mr. Rajasingham. Now, if I'm an exporter trying to produce an organic product, now I can by myself go and apply individually for certification, right? That's one approach. And I believe the other approach is that you get together as a farmer group and you go for a group certification, which is very common in Sri Lanka. Now, can you explain the differences between these and maybe the advantages of what is the best way for a small country like us?
Well, the group certification is mainly for smallholders who cannot afford to have their own individual certification, because the cost of certification may be quite high. And there are to qualify for group certification, there are certain rules and regulations you must follow. Now, with the change in EU regulations, you have to be aware that there are going to be quite a lot of changes. Now, EU regulations, the new regulations came into was put out in 2018, and it was supposed to come into effect in 2021, but due to the COVID crisis, it has been deferred by 1 year. So from 2022, the new EU regulations will come into force. Now, what you got to be aware is, under the new EU regulations, the contract production is no longer accepted. So you cannot, now what happens is most of the companies, they have a group of farmers who do what we call contract production. That means you produce and sell directly to the company, the producer himself. Now, with the change in rules, that is not possible. So under the new regulation, you have to have a legal entity. And the legal entity is what is going to be certified.
Right. So it is predominantly like a farmer-producer organization?
Yeah, so it can be a cooperative, it can be, as far as I know, you can register as a voluntary service organization, a cooperative or society, or even a guarantee company. So the most important thing to remember is, from 2022 onwards, there will be the new requirement where you have to be a legal entity. But of course, for those who are already certified, there is a transition period, a 3-year transition period. So they can continue as it is, but be mindful that come 2025, things will change. So the other things that you have to remember is, as of today, or as it is now, the new standards also have limitations on land holdings. So to qualify as a smallholder, you cannot have more than 5 hectares, right? And there are 2 other conditions you have to fulfill. That means one is your total organic output cannot be more than 15,000 euro, or total organic turnover cannot be more than 25,000 euro a year, and the cost of certification should not be more than 2% of your annual turnover. So if you fulfill all these conditions, then you can be certified under the group certification. But anybody over 5 hectares or the other 2 conditions that I mentioned, if you do not comply with that, then you have to have your individual certification. So this is something which is worrying, because that means that anybody who has more than 5 hectares may have to go for individual certification, which also can be a costly affair, and which is something which you have to be mindful. Now, these same rules do not apply for US or JAS at the moment, but there are the US standards are being revised, and the public consultation is over, and the US also requires now a legal entity, but there is no limit on the land size or other formalities. So this is something which people have to be aware of, and in a time sense, 3 years is not much. Before you blink and wake up, the 3 years would have lapsed. So therefore, you have to be mindful of this.
Right. But now, group certification, let's say you have 50 farmers, right, under group certification program. And but isn't it too cost to manage that? Because if one farmer defaults, right, then the whole certification process fails. Is that the understanding?
Not exactly. See, under the group certification, the responsibility, there is some delegated responsibility towards the legal entity. That means instead of the certification body going through the entire, visiting all the farms, they delegate certain amount of authority and responsibility to what we call the internal control system. So under to be very brief, the internal control system is something which you generate, where you have your internal organic standards, your team of internal inspections. And one of the most important things in the internal ICS that you have to remember is that it's mandatory that all farms are inspected at least once every year. So what happens in that is that the certification body passes on some responsibility to you. And what is actually inspected in that is your certification system. And there is a process of re-inspection. Under the new regulation, 5% of the farms will be re-inspected. So when I say re-inspected, the external inspection body will not say, for example, if you have 500 farmers, the certification body is not going to visit all 500 farms. They will take 5% of those 500 farms, which is 25 farms. And the 25 farms will be re-inspected. And if during that process issues come up, you would have to correct the issues. But if the external inspectors' findings and your internal inspectors' findings don't match, that means there is an issue with your internal control system. That may lead to, I wouldn't say lead to a temporary suspension, and if it's not corrected, may be even lead to decertification. So you have to be mindful of the fact. And another factor that you have to be mindful of is under the new EU regulation. There is also a requirement that 2% of all the farms have to be sampled for soil testing or leaf testing. So if you have, say, 500 farms, that means they will have to take samples from 10 farms, which also is going to add to your cost. And the samples have to be analyzed at an EU accredited lab. So this is something which has to be addressed, because if the samples are to be sent to Europe, it's going to cost you. So if 500 farms is fine, but if you have, say, 2,000 members, which is also another point to remember. See, under the new EU regulations, the maximum in an ICS is only 2,000. So if you have more than 2,000, you have to create a new ICS, right? And the other most important thing under the new regulation that you have to remember is that, or be aware of, is that the ICS, right now the ICS is all managed by the exporter. But under the new regulations, the ICS has to be managed by the legal entity itself. So which means you have to have your own staff, you have to pay them salaries, benefits, all that. And so imagine you having 2,000 farmers, which is the maximum. So for 100 farmers will be inspected and 40 samples have to be analyzed. So this is something which you have to consider when you are budgeting for your organic inspection, maybe in 3 years.
Can we go into more details in terms of certification process?
You mean how to get certified and what the steps are?
Exactly.
And the post-audit
let's cover the main steps. Yes.
Okay. So the most important thing is that first you have to identify your target market. So based on your target market is the standard. So for example, if you want to export, your main buyer is in Europe, then you need to be certified according to the EU regulation. So the first step is you have to identify a certification body which is accredited to do inspections according to the EU regulations in Sri Lanka. So if I remember correctly, I think there are 8 certification bodies who are accredited to do the certification in Sri Lanka according to EU regulations. Now you also have to consider other factors such as the cost of certification, the language, because if the certification body has a local representative, then the certification or the inspection procedure is going to be much more easier. Not that it cannot be done with a translator, but it might be a smoother flow if the inspector spoke the local languages. Now, once it also is important to remember that you need to be guided by your buyer, because certain certification bodies have more acceptance in certain markets than within the European Union than outside, than other countries. So you have to also be guided by your buyer. So once you have identified the certification body, you need to contact them and ask them for a quotation. Or they will send you, most probably what happens is they'll send you a questionnaire. And in the questionnaire, they'll ask you the number of farms or the holding or the size, what type of product, and the locations, because whether to decide on how much of traveling is involved and to calculate the number of days. So once that is done, they will send you a quotation. And once you have accepted the quotation, they will send you a template which is called the Organic System Plan. System Plan or OSP. So you have to fill in that. What actually happens in the Organic System Plan is you have to describe how you are going to guarantee or how you are going to do your organic production and how you are going to guarantee certain things required in the standards. Once that is also accepted by the certification body, and the operator will have to agree on the dates for inspection. So on the date of inspection, the inspector will come along and he will, if it is a group certification, and then he will choose the sample of farms to be inspected. And like I told you earlier, it's 5. There's a guideline. So based on that, he will choose the number of farms to be inspected. And depending on the distance, it can be 4 farms, it can be 5 farms that will be inspected on a daily basis. And once the inspection is over, the inspector will sit with you and discuss the findings. So at the finding stage is where you will get to know whether you have any non-compliances, and whether the non-compliances are major, minor, or minor. Now, generally, a violation of the standard, like for example, use of a prohibited substance in a farm would be a major non-compliance, which may lead to that particular farm having to be excluded from the certification. Right. So once that is over, either the certification body will share the report with you at the closing meeting, or they will send it to you within a stipulated time, depending on their system, operating procedure, for your confirmation. And if you have any non-conformities, you have to now suggest the corrective measures for the non-conformity. So some may be minor, some may be major. For example, if you do not have documentation, a proper documentation or proper farm diary, that may constitute a minor non-compliance. So each certification body has its own catalogue of sanctions, and then you have to suggest a corrective measure. And once the corrective measure is accepted, you will have to also provide some sort of evidence to say how you have corrected or how you have fulfilled the corrective measure. Once everything is done, then you of course will receive your certificate. So this process can take anything between 1 to 3 months, depending on how many non-conformities you have or how many non-conformities you don't have. Now, if you don't have any non-conformities, the process is much shorter.
Now, Mr. Rajasingham, we were talking about certification process, and we arrived at a critical point where we talk about non-conformity issues. Can we dig a bit deeper and talk about these issues? Maybe bring up a few examples to understand what this is.
So basically, a non-conformity non-conformity occurs when the standard has not been followed. So the non-conformity can be classified in many ways. It can be a minor, it can be irregularity, it can be a violation, or it can be a major non-compliance. Depending on the type of non-conformity, it can have short-term or long-term consequences. For example, if you take a farm and the non-conformity is the use of prohibited substance, and that would have long-term consequences. Because if you have used prohibited substance, that means you have to start the certificate conversion process all over again. That means you start from year 0. But if the non-conformity is minor, for example, say one of the requirements is that you must have proper documentation, and you say for some reason that you have not updated your documentation or you don't have documentation, and the certification body finds you non-compliant with the requirement in the standard, that can be classified as a minor non-compliance, and then it has a short-term consequence in the sense you have to take steps to correct the non-compliance. Now, there can be occasions where repeated non-compliances. Now, remember, certification is an annual event. It's not a lifetime thing, right? Every year it has to be done. So, if at every year you have the same non-conformity, right? That minor can over a period of time can become major and have long-term consequences. So what you have to remember is that the nature of the non-compliance determines the consequence. So if it is minor, it can be corrected immediately. But if it is major or violation, a gross violation of the standard, like using a prohibited substance or mixing organic and non-organic product, right? That can have far-reaching consequences and different from normal non-compliance, and each non-compliance has to be treated separately and in a different manner.
Right. Now, let's say we went through the process. We achieved our conformity levels and everything. So then, what's next?
Okay. Say you have had the inspection. You have accepted the report. You have fulfilled the non-conformities. They have corrected the non-conformities, and now you will get a certificate. So once you get the certificate, that means you are now certified organic. So you can start exporting, you can start labeling. So each regulation has its own labeling requirements, which are fairly detailed in the standards. So the next step is export. So export of organic products is not very different from export of a normal product, except in the case of EU, there is a system called a certificate of inspection, which is required for you to export to Europe. Now, it is not required for exports to US or to Japan. But what happens most of the time is the US customer or the Japanese customer will ask for what is called a transaction certificate, which is very similar to a certificate of inspection. Now, the certificate of inspection is done through traces, that's Trade Control and Export System, which is a EU traceability system, which is done online and electronically. So once you have completed your export formalities, or before you complete your export formalities, you have to apply, or once you get your certification, you have to get in touch with your certification body and ask them to help you get into the traces system. You have to register in traces, where you have a login and a password. And after every export, you have to enter the details and provide the documentation, the transport documentation and invoice. Now, without your traces or without the certificate of inspection, goods cannot enter into Europe. So if you don't fulfill that requirement, your buyer will not be able to clear the goods at the European port of entry as certified organic. So he will either have to wait till you fulfill the formalities, or that product will have to be sold as non-organic or conventional. So it's a very important for EU that you follow the traces program. For NOP or exports to US, Canada or Japanese or to Japan, most often customers will ask you, then you have to apply to the certification body who will provide you the relevant, what we call transaction certificate, which must accompany, it's not mandatory. I mean, they don't need it to clear customs.
Right. But this is for NOP and USD.
NOP, JAS and so that is basically for their own record and for traceability. So that's how it works.
Mr. Rajasingham, I believe we have come towards end of this particular episode. But I believe we covered several major areas with respect to organic certification. We talked about what is certification, why it is important, and then we talked about the certification process and different certification standards, and then we also talked about the export process as well. Now, as a final point, what would be your advice for someone who's getting into this organic certification sector? What would they have to expect in this process?
Well, from I wouldn't say advice, but you have to be mindful that if you want to label a product as organic and sell it in certain markets like Europe or US or Japan, then you have to follow. It's a legal requirement. It's not a voluntary certification. It's a mandatory requirement. Yes. And there are also the certification process does not end with the first year. It's a continuous process, and it's also a continuous improvement process. So I wouldn't say it's a difficult task. So once a company has made its decision and committed itself to follow organic practices and organic rules, it doesn't end with the first year. It's a continuous process, and non-conformities may happen, may not happen, but it's not the end of the world. Right. So non-conformities basically come up because either the interpretation is wrong or misinterpreted. So the main thing you have to understand is the certification or inspection process is a process of improvement, is also a process that is mandatory, and something which also will help your business grow. And the less non-conformities you have, the less problems you have. And it's something now that the company is committed to go into organic, you should carry on. And we wish all the companies going into organic all the best in their organic future.
Mr. Rajasingham, where can someone find more information about the organic certification process?
More information you can get from the import promotion desk at the Export Development Board or from their website.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajasingham, spending your time with us and explaining the organic certification process with us. And for those who are watching, thank you very much for being with us. And we hope to come to you with another interesting episode very soon.